The warded chamber. The descent into the archive's depths felt like crossing into another world entirely. Cassian led the way down stone stairs that predated the current palace by centuries, Elena close behind him. Each step took them further from the morning light filtering through the palace windows, deeper into passages where the air grew heavy with the weight of accumulated magic and forbidden knowledge. The iron ring on Cassian's finger pulsed with increasing intensity as they descended. The ley lines ran stronger here, concentrated by ancient workings that channeled power through the bedrock beneath Thornhaven. He could feel them now, even without focusing, a constant hum in his bones that had never been there before. Another change, another mark of what he was becoming. "How far down does this go?" Elena's voice echoed off the stone walls, sounding smaller than usual. "Section 7 is on the 4th sublevel," Cassian replied, his own voice strange in the confined space. "The warded practice chamber is 1 level below that." "Below the forbidden texts?" Elena's footsteps hesitated briefly. What could possibly need to be deeper than the most dangerous knowledge in the kingdom? Cassian glanced back at her, seeing his own unease reflected in her green eyes. A place where that knowledge can be safely tested, where the consequences of failure can be contained. They passed through a checkpoint where ancient ward glyphs flickered in the stone, responding to Archmage Verina's authorization that still clung to Cassian like an invisible mantle. The glyphs pulsed once, twice, then subsided, granting passage. Cassian wondered if Verina had known, when she granted him access, exactly how far he would descend. If she had anticipated this moment when he would walk willingly into the deepest darkness the kingdom possessed. The passage opened into a small antechamber lit by cold blue mage light. A single door stood before them, made of iron bound with silver and covered in layered protective enchantments. The magic radiating from it was different from anything Cassian had encountered. Not the structured, orderly power of conventional thaumaturgy, but something older and more primal. Containment magic designed not to channel power, but to prevent it from escaping. "This is it," Cassian said quietly. He placed his palm against the door, feeling the wards test him, probe at his magical signature. The dark veins at his temples throbbed in response, and for a moment he felt the wards recoil, recognizing corruption. But Verina's authorization overrode their instinct to reject him. And the door swung open with a grinding sound that spoke of centuries without use. The chamber beyond was larger than Cassian had expected, perhaps 50 feet across, with a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. The walls were bare stone, inscribed with layer upon layer of containment circles and binding sigils. The floor was marked with a complex geometric pattern, channels carved deep into the rock and filled with what looked like crystallized magic, creating a permanent ritual space of tremendous power. In the center stood a raised platform surrounded by a circle of standing stones covered in script so old Cassian couldn't read it. "Gods," Elena breathed. "This place feels wrong." Cassian nodded slowly. Wrong was accurate, but not quite complete. The chamber felt expectant, like something that had been waiting a very long time to be used again. The air itself seemed to lean in toward the central platform, as if the space had developed an appetite over centuries of containing dangerous magic. "The texts said this chamber was built during the original sealing," Cassian said, moving forward carefully. His boots scraped against stone that felt almost warm beneath his feet, despite the cold that should have dominated this deep beneath the earth. When the founding mages needed a place to practice the forbidden workings they would use against the Void Weaver. After the sealing succeeded, it was sealed. I don't think anyone has been down here in 300 years. Elena followed him to the edge of the central circle, her face pale in the dim light. "And we're going to use it for the same purpose, to practice the same magic that killed 68 of the 73 mages who tried it. We don't have a choice." Cassian set down the texts he'd brought from Section 7, along with the components he'd gathered. A silver knife, candles made from rendered fat mixed with grave dust, and other materials he'd never imagined needing. "The Void Weaver is waking, the wards are failing, and I'm the only one willing to do what's necessary." Not the only one. Elena placed her own bag beside his, containing the monitoring equipment she'd insisted on bringing. Devices to measure magical flux, record observations, track physiological changes. I'm here. That makes me complicit in this, Cassian. If you're going to damn yourself, you won't do it alone. He turned to face her fully, seeing the fear in her eyes, but also the fierce determination. Elena Brightwater, who had been his rival at the academy, who had competed with him for top marks in theoretical thaumaturgy and practical spellcraft, who had somehow become something more important than a rival or even a friend, an anchor to the person he had been before corruption began its work. You can still leave, he said quietly. Mordain gave his tacit permission, but that protection only extends to me. If anyone discovers you were here, helping me practice anathema-class magic, then I'll face the consequences. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the fine lines of worry around her eyes, the shadows beneath them from a night spent waiting while he studied horrors. You need someone to watch, to remember who you were before this started, and to stop you if it goes too far. Cassian wanted to argue, to send her away where she would be safe from both the magic he was about to attempt and the judgment that would inevitably fall on anyone associated with him. But he needed her, not just as a witness or failsafe, but as a reminder that there was still something worth saving, both in the kingdom and in himself. All right, he said finally. But you stay outside the circles. The containment wards are designed to prevent anything inside from escaping, but that also means they'll trap whatever happens in here. If something goes wrong, I'll do what needs to be done. Elena's hand moved to the knife at her belt, a practical blade she'd carried since their academy days. The implication was clear. I promised you that already. Cassian nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He turned back to the central platform, studying the ritual space with new eyes. The geometric patterns carved into the floor were designed to channel and contain tremendous magical forces. The standing stones around the platform were anchors, points where the chamber's wards could be focused to prevent catastrophic release. Everything about this place spoke of magic practiced at the edge of control, working so dangerous they required multiple layers of protection just to attempt. He opened the first of the forbidden texts, finding the page he'd marked during his night of study. The spell was deceptively simple in its description, a working to manifest void flame, the most basic expression of anathema-class magic. Fire that burned without fuel, that consumed not wood or oil, but the essence of the caster themselves. The text warned that even this fundamental working would leave marks, would begin the transformation that could never be reversed. Cassian had already performed it once in the reading room upstairs. That 30-second candle flame had been enough to create the soul bond, to mark him permanently with corruption. But that had been done in haste, without proper preparation or understanding. Here, in this chamber designed for such workings, he could practice properly, could learn to control the power rather than simply unleashing it, could walk further down the path from which there was no return. I'm going to start with the void flame again, he said, positioning himself on the central platform. The stone felt warm beneath his feet, almost eager. The same working I did last night, but this time I'll try to maintain it longer. Control the burn rate. The texts say that mastery comes from learning to regulate how much of yourself you feed into the working. Elena had already set up her monitoring equipment at the edge of the circle, devices that would track magical flux and measure the ambient corruption. She looked up from her preparations, meeting his eyes. How long? 2 minutes, Cassian said. Long enough to prove I can sustain it beyond the initial casting. Not so long that he didn't finish the sentence. Not so long that the corruption would spread too quickly, that the darkness would dig its hooks too deep. Not so long that he would lose himself entirely in the first real practice session. Ready when you are, Elena said quietly. Cassian took a deep breath, centering himself as he'd been taught at the academy. But this was nothing like the structured meditations of conventional magic. Anathema-class workings required a different kind of preparation. Not clearing the mind, but opening it. Not building barriers, but tearing them down. He had to make himself vulnerable, had to allow the magic to reach the core of what he was and begin its terrible transformation. He began the working. The words came from somewhere deep inside, not memorized, but remembered. As if he'd always known them, had been born with this knowledge written into his bones. His hands moved through gestures that felt both alien and natural, tracing patterns in the air that left faint after images of shadow. And with each word, each gesture, he felt something inside him begin to burn. Not his flesh, not his physical body, but something deeper. The texts had called it essence, soul stuff, the fundamental architecture of self. Whatever its name, Cassian felt it ignite as the working took hold. Felt pieces of who he was begin to transmute into raw, magical power. A flame appeared above his outstretched palm, black at the core, edged with purple that shifted to sickly green at the tips. It cast no light, only shadow, darkness that seemed to eat the chamber's ambient illumination. The void flame danced and flickered, sustained not by any external fuel, but by Cassian himself. He held it, felt the burn spreading through him, cold rather than hot. The flame wanted to grow, wanted to consume more of him, but he forced it to remain small, controlled. The effort required was immense. Not the mental discipline of conventional spellcraft, but a constant battle against the magic's nature. Anathema-class workings wanted to devour, wanted to take everything and leave nothing behind. 30 seconds. Elena's voice came from outside the circle, tight with tension. Cassian, your veins. He could feel them darkening, the corruption spreading from his temples down his neck. The price of holding the flame. Every second it burned, more of him was consumed, more of his essence transmuted into power. But he held on, refusing to let the magic break free or collapse. 1 minute. The flame pulsed in his palm, growing slightly larger despite his control. Cassian gritted his teeth, feeling sweat bead on his forehead despite the chamber's cold. The burn was spreading through his chest now, a cold fire in his lungs with each breath. He could taste ash and something worse, the flavor of his own corruption, bitter and wrong. 90 seconds. Cassian, the readings are... He heard the alarm in Elena's voice but couldn't spare attention to respond. All his focus was on the flame, on keeping it contained while it tried to spread. The void flame wanted to grow. Wanted to consume not just him but everything around him, to spread until nothing remained but darkness and ash. The standing stones around the platform began to glow, responding to the power he was channeling. The chamber's ancient wards activated, containing the corruption before it could spread beyond the ritual space. Cassian felt them close around him, like a cage. Felt the weight of 300-year-old magic pressing down. 2 minutes. Elena's shout broke through his concentration. Cassian, stop! He released the working, letting the void flame collapse back into himself. The flame guttered and died, leaving him gasping on the platform. The cold burn in his chest began to fade, but slowly, too slowly. The corruption had spread further this time, had dug deeper into whatever made him himself. Cassian dropped to one knee, breathing hard. His hands were shaking, and when he looked at them, he could see dark lines running beneath the skin, like veins filled with ink. The marks of what he'd done, the price of 2 minutes of controlled power. Cassian! Elena was at the edge of the circle, one hand reaching toward him, but stopping just short of crossing the containment line. Are you all right? He nodded slowly, not trusting his voice. After a moment, he managed to stand, though his legs felt weak. The chamber's wards were still active, still glowing faintly as they contained the residual corruption from his working. He could feel the magic in the walls, analyzing what he'd done, measuring the threat he represented, judging whether he should be allowed to leave. The readings, Cassian said hoarsely. What did you measure? Elena consulted her devices, her face pale in their blue light. Corruption spread at a rate of approximately 3% per 30 seconds. If you'd held it longer... She broke off, looking up at him with fear in her eyes. Cassian, at that rate, you'd be completely consumed in less than 20 minutes of sustained casting. 20 minutes. Less time than it would take to walk from the palace to the city's outer walls. Less time than a single engagement against Shadowspawn would likely require. And this was just the most basic working, the simplest expression of anathema-class magic. What would happen when he attempted something more complex? Something powerful enough to actually threaten the Voidweaver? I need to practice more, Cassian said, moving toward the edge of the platform. The chamber's wards pulsed once, then subsided, allowing him to cross the containment line. Need to learn to slow the burn rate, to control the corruption. Cassian, you can barely stand. Elena caught his arm as he stumbled slightly. Her fingers were cold against his skin. Or perhaps he was simply running hot with the residual effects of the working. You need to rest. Let your body recover. There isn't time. He pulled away gently, moving to the bags where he'd stored the texts. The wards are failing. The Void Weaver is waking. Every day I spend recovering is a day closer to catastrophe. And every working you attempt brings you closer to losing yourself entirely. Elena's voice rose, echoing off the chamber walls. Did you see what happened? You were barely in control. If you'd held it even 30 seconds longer, then I would have learned my limits. Cassian turned to face her, seeing his reflection in her frightened eyes. The dark veins were visible now even in the dim light, spreading from his temples down his neck like cracks in porcelain. His own eyes had taken on a faint shadow, as if darkness was pooling behind them. I need to know exactly how far I can push before it becomes irreversible. It already is irreversible. Elena stepped closer, her voice dropping to something between anger and pleading. You created the soul bond last night. There's no going back from that. But you can still control how fast you descend. You can still what? Cassian asked quietly. Still pretend there's a path where I come out of this unchanged? Where I stop the Void Weaver and remain the person you knew at the academy? He shook his head. That person is already gone, Elena. The moment I spoke the first words of the Void Flame, that Cassian Netherbane ceased to exist. All I can do now is try to save the kingdom before the corruption consumes whatever's left. Silence fell between them, heavy with everything they couldn't say. In the distance, Cassian could hear water dripping somewhere in the archive's depths, could feel the ley lines humming through the bedrock, their power flowing inexorably southward toward the Shadowvale wastes, toward the Void Weaver, toward the entity that was waiting for him with infinite patience. One more attempt, Elena said finally. One more practice session, and then we leave this chamber. You need food, sleep, recovery time. Even if there isn't much time left, you're no good to anyone if you burn yourself out before the real fight begins. Cassian wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he needed to push harder, learn faster. But the exhaustion was catching up with him, the toll of a sleepless night and 2 castings of forbidden magic. Elena was right. He needed to pace himself, to learn the rhythms of corruption before he could hope to control it. All right, he agreed. One more attempt. I'll try to hold the Void Flame for 3 minutes this time. If I can, no. Elena's voice was firm. 2 minutes again, the same duration, but this time focus on control, on reducing the burn rate. Master the basics before you push for more power. It was sensible advice, the kind of measured approach to magical study they'd been taught at the academy. But Cassian felt the impatience burning in him. The terrible urgency that came from knowing the wards were failing and time was running out. Still, Elena was his anchor, his reminder of who he had been. If he ignored her counsel now, what would that say about how much of himself he'd already lost? 2 minutes, he agreed, focused on control. He returned to the central platform, feeling the chamber's wards pulse in recognition. The stone was warmer now, as if his previous working had awakened something in the ancient magic. The standing stones around him hummed with contained power, ready to prevent catastrophic release if his control slipped. Cassian centered himself again, but this time he was aware of how different it felt from conventional meditation. He wasn't seeking calm or clarity. He was opening himself to darkness, inviting corruption to flow through him so he could learn to channel it. The distinction was subtle but profound. He began the working. The words came easier this time, the gestures more fluid. His body was learning the patterns, adapting to the demands of anathema-class magic. The void flame appeared in his palm, black cord and shadow-edged, casting its unlight across the chamber. But this time, Cassian didn't just hold it. He studied it, felt the way his essence flowed into the flame, transmuting from whatever made him human into raw magical power. He could sense the burn rate, could feel the corruption spreading through him with each passing second. And slowly, carefully, he began to adjust the flow. The flame flickered, growing slightly smaller. The burn in his chest eased fractionally. Cassian held his breath, maintaining the delicate balance between feeding the working enough to sustain it and starving it enough to slow the corruption. 30 seconds. Elena called. Corruption rate is down to 2%. Cassian, you're doing it. He was. The void flame burned steady in his palm, contained and controlled. The price was still being paid. He could feel more of himself being consumed with each heartbeat, but slower now. More measured. This was what the text had meant by mastery. Not eliminating the cost, but learning to regulate it. 1 minute, holding steady. The standing stones pulsed around him, their ancient magic monitoring his working. Cassian could feel them analyzing the void flame, comparing it to workings performed 3 centuries ago by the founding mages. Judging whether he possessed the strength and control to walk the path they had walked, whether he could survive what they had not. 90 seconds. Corruption rate holding at 2%. The chamber felt different now, less hostile. As if the ancient wards recognized what he was attempting, understood the necessity that drove him. Or perhaps that was just the corruption speaking, whispering that he belonged here in this place of forbidden magic, that he had always belonged here. 2 minutes. Cassian, you can stop. He held the flame for 3 more seconds, proving to himself that he could. Then he released the working, letting the void flame collapse back into darkness. The cold burn faded more quickly this time, the corruption settling into him rather than spreading wildly. When he looked at his hands, the dark veins were still there, still visible, but they hadn't spread significantly beyond where they'd been after the first working. Progress. Control. Mastery. The first steps on a path that led only to darkness. Cassian stepped off the platform, his legs more steady this time. Elena was there immediately, helping him despite his protests. Her hands were warm against his skin, or perhaps he was simply running cold now. Another change, another mark of what he was becoming. That was better, she said, consulting her devices. Much better. If you can maintain that level of control, then I might last 30 minutes instead of 20, Cassian finished. Still not enough, not nearly enough. But it's a start. Elena packed away her equipment, her movements brisk and efficient. You're learning. That's what matters. Now we leave this chamber, we get you food and rest, and tomorrow we try again. Cassian nodded, gathering the texts and components. As he turned toward the door, he caught sight of the chamber's walls, the layers upon layers of containment circles and binding sigils. 300 years ago, 73 mages had practiced in this space, preparing for the working that would seal the Voidweaver. Only 5 had survived the sealing itself, and those 5 had been so corrupted they'd had to be imprisoned until the darkness consumed them. He was walking the same path they had walked, practicing the same magic that had destroyed them. And unlike them, he was doing it alone, with only Elena to watch and remember who he had been. The weight of that knowledge settled over him like a shroud as they climbed back toward the light. Behind them, the warded chamber fell silent once more, but the warmth in the stone remained, and the standing stones continued their faint pulsing. The chamber had been awakened after 3 centuries of sleep, and it was hungry for more.
Thanks for watching our stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more epic adventures. Thanks for watching our stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more epic adventures.